The armed conflict in Syria began in March 2011, when Bashar al-Assad fired into a crowd of civilians during the Arab Spring protests. In July of that year, civilians began to take up arms. Various militant opposition groups are formed, and some soldiers defected from Assad's army to form the Free Syrian Army and fight the Assad regime. In 2012, al-Qaeda forms a branch in Syria called Jabhat al-Nusra, around the same time when Kurdish groups seeking autonomy take up arms and secede from Assad's rule. That summer, through Iran's and Hezbollah's intervention on Assad's behalf, Syria becomes a proxy war along religious Sunni-Shia lines between Iran and the Gulf states, where the Gulf in turn is sending money and weapons to various opposition groups via Jordan and Turkey. In April of 2013, Assad uses chemical weapons on civilians, shortly after the US threatens to invade and Russia and China speak out on behalf of the Assad regime, establishing Syria as a proxy war between superpowers. Weeks later, CIA training and arms reach opposition groups in Syria, most predominantly the Free Syrian Army. Later that year, many combatants of the Free Syrian Army defect to join al-Nusra, and in February of 2014, an al-Qaeda affiliate group in neighboring Iraq breaks away from al-Qaeda, unites with al-Nusra, and starts carving out territory in Iraq and Syria, calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The Islamic State does not fight Assad, but they instead at times collaborate on fighting the Kurds and various other opposition groups. While Assad and the Islamic State remain useful to each other, the West, led by America, now struggles to balance both its militant agendas of dismantling post-Cold War Russian alliances in the Middle East and fighting the global war on terror. According to many statistics, over half the Syrian population has been killed or displaced internally, regionally, or internationally. Displaced Syrians face hardships and challenges as they struggle to flee the war in search of a life free of state-led and militant violence. Their opportunities are limited through insufficient basic livelihood support, lack of economic opportunities, ever-changing country and border policies, strenuous and often life-threatening journeys, and racism. Civilians inside Syria, especially in opposition-controlled territories, lack access to basic humanitarian assistance. They therefore become more vulnerable to be coerced into joining militant groups in an attempt to protect their lives and their families. Regionally displaced Syrians face increased vulnerability and exploitation through tightening border regulations, decreasing humanitarian assistance, and limited job opportunities. Unable to resettle properly, even temporarily, many Syrians feel like they live in a state of limbo, unwelcome and unwanted in their host country. Those who have the funds, social networks, and capability to attempt the journey to Europe often face violence and degradation at the EU borders, are at times exploited by smugglers, and encounter growing racism and right-wing radicalization in many EU member states. Though German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced her refugees welcome policy that has animated especially civil society to help displaced Syrians access their needs and facilitate integration, this policy stands in sharp contrast to checkpoints and stop-and-check searches that are resurrected throughout Europe, starting only days after, and the political debate about safe and non-safe migrant origin states that emerged throughout politics and media. The media and political agendas they support portray trends of linking mobility and threat. Persons who are stuck either within Syria or within the region are most commonly depicted as helpless and in need of humanitarian assistance. Displaced persons with the agency to move are most commonly represented by young radicalized males who jump over fences, disrespect the Western social norms, and are accused of Islamicizing Western society. Most recently, images of packed boats in the Mediterranean and children drowning in the sea visually and almost literally announce the coming wave of the refugee crisis. These landscapes of images have the effect of falsely dehumanizing forced migrants, instilling fear and pity in the Western population, and delinking their movement from the global power politics and our own government involvement in the ongoing wars in Syria and the greater Middle East. These images play into the wider security policies that the European Union is implementing around borders and migration. Borders as means of creating and upholding social spatial order that were deactivated through the founding and unification of the EU, and have now been reactivated through the high-tech security fences, border controls, checkpoints, stops and searches, raids, and deportations, which all make the state securitization system ever more omnipresent. In an attempt to externalize the so-called refugee crisis and to control movement into the region, several European countries have sent money to regional actors such as Turkey and Lebanon to help contain the movement of displaced persons. It becomes clear that even with regards to human security, the citizens in the host countries and not the Syrians fleeing the war are the primary persons of concern. Instead, global security policies that dictate migration policy seek to control which people move where and when. Both biopolitics, strategies and mechanisms through which human life processes are managed under regimes of authority in order to maintain power and control, and necropolitics, the politics of death, are valuable frames of analysis. Mark Duffield argues global civil war is being fought not between armies, but at the level of existence itself, in the distinction between those who can die and those whose lives need to be protected. He says that one cannot have either development or security without containing the circulation of underdevelopment or non-insured life. Thus, in order for Europe and its Western allies to ensure their own development and consequently securitize their comparative abundance as well as their spheres of powerful influence on and over the Middle East, policymakers deactivate and reactivate security measures such as borders and funding militant groups depending on political agendas and strategies. The Middle East history is blood-marked with colonial and later neoliberal economic and political agendas, war-making, nation-building that is modeled to facilitate the exploitation of the country's land and people. Syria, the once French colony, became an important ally to the former USSR during the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War in sight, Syria's foreign minister announced, "Our economic links with the region are with the West." However, Syria's support for resistance fighters such as Hamas and Hezbollah made relations with the West, especially the US and Israel, challenging. Today, in the post-Cold War era Europe that was once divided by the Iron Curtain, the Chancellor of the once divided Germany overthrew the Dublin Protocol and refuses to set a limit on the number of displaced Syrians Germany is willing to take in. As the migration wave of Syrians continue to Germany, many are reminded of the migration waves leaving Europe only 70 years before. Angela Merkel's ongoing open-door refugee policies that go against the policy recommendations of her own party, the CDU, are often interpreted as a mixture of humanism and German Holocaust guilt. But one does wonder what larger geopolitical policies and strategies are at play here. With the effective collapse of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and being reminded of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice shifting foreign policy phraseology by speaking about the new Middle East, it raises questions of the future of the Middle East and its people. We are currently witnessing the nation-building strategies causing a fundamental reshaping of sovereign territory by the Islamic State and other warring parties in Iraq and Syria. Terrorist attacks claimed by the Islamic State have jolted Europe into increased securitization and active warfare against the newly founded caliphate. Vast regions of Syria are now uninhabited, as migration trends of displaced Syrians seek refuge behind Europe's securitized borders. The right-wing and nationalist voices are once again becoming more vocal, through parties such as Pegida, Alternative for Germany, and Le Front National. The social and political fabric of both Europe and the Levant are changing. What does this mean for the future of Syrian people? What does this mean for our collective future?